Back in 2023, a friend and I bought packrafts and headed out to the Patagonian wilderness for an adventure following the routes of the Greater Patagonian Trail, otherwise known as the GPT. Here follows a visual story of our trip.
We've arrived after 24 hours in buses and we are packing the kit for the first time. It's all a bit of a mess right now, but soon it'll be organized and we're going to take on the Rio Puello. We had taken the overnight bus from Santiago to Puerto Varas, from where we continued by bus and ferry to the start of the Rio Puello, a mountain river with immaculate turquoise waters surrounded by lush green forests and snow-capped peaks. This was the reason we had come all the way to Chile and Patagonia. Our journey had finally begun, and what a few months before had been just dreams was now our reality. The morning light was beautiful, and this river serene, and we enjoyed the few kilometers of paddling that morning before having to pack up and hike around the canyon section, with rapids slightly too powerful for us to paddle in our little rafts. We realized just how heavy the bags were, and that the hiking over the next few months was going to be tough. It started to rain a little as we hiked, but as we reached the turquoise waters of the Rio Puello, the hardships of the hike and the damp weather were soon forgotten, and we floated down amongst waterfalls and rapids with minimal effort, savoring the moment. The rain settled in that evening, and we found somewhere in the woods to camp out. By the next morning, though, the sun came out to greet us again, and we continued on downstream. The wind was against us that day as we headed west towards the coast, and we opted to take the ferry back across Lago Tagoa rather than battling hopelessly against these strong headwinds. The following stretch of river had some great bouncy rapids that were fun to paddle, giving me my adrenaline fix. As evening crept up, we found a camp spot for the night and made ourselves comfortable. We were back on the trail, hiking east. After reaching the mouth of Rio Puello, we had taken the bus back upstream to the point that we had launched from just 4 days before. By chance, we were invited to camp in the garden of a local settler that evening, right by the lakeside. They were so warm and friendly to us, even insisting that we join them for a barbecue. Of course, we said yes, and our shrinking stomachs were grateful. The next morning, we crossed into Argentina, getting our passports stamped at the most remote border post either of us had ever been at before. We were now heading east, moving with the predominant winds, and we made the most of this on Lago Puello, sailing with the wind on what could otherwise have been a very difficult lake crossing. Sadly, the next morning the winds were not so friendly. The waves were hitting us side on, which actually led to my friend capsizing in the middle of the lake. Luckily, I was there to help him. We all stayed dry, our kit worked, and we kept going in the sunshine. The Lago Puello National Park really was beautiful, and we were sad to have to leave it, but excited for the upcoming hiking section. To continue on our packrafting route and reach the next lake, we had to first hike over a mountain pass that stood in our way, carrying the boats with us, of course. We knew little about the footpath or its condition, but expected the worst and plenty of bush bashing. The first day of hiking was hot, but at least we had a good trail. There had clearly been some donkeys on it or mules before, and we made good progress. The woods were beautiful and full of wildflowers, and it felt so good walking in the shade. The second day already was a bit more challenging. I think we did only 10 kilometers in total. There was a lot of bushwhacking, but the reward was the most magnificent campsite ever. Right on the mountain pass, with a stunning view of the Tres Torres mountain peaks. Up in the mountains, we were at an altitude of over 1,000 meters now, and overnight the temperatures dropped to below freezing, leading us to wake up to a frosty world, our water bottles frozen solid. We had to light a fire that morning to warm our hands. The next day again was extremely challenging. We were already a little bit tired, and there was no more path. We had to walk in the river most of the day. Our feet were full of seeds, spiky thorns, prickly grasses, and we were chased by these horseflies that would attack from nowhere. But again, it was a beautiful place. This was the true wilderness we had come to be in, and I think my fondest memories will be of this mountain crossing, just because it was so tough and it was a challenge. And in hindsight, you always look on these things with rose-tinted glasses. Finally, on our last day, we were hiking back downhill towards open water. Very relieved, we set out paddling across Lago Chalila, a lake with beautiful clear waters. This was outdone, however, by how clear the water was on the river. Rio Carilaufu was just something else in terms of water clarity. But we were so exhausted at this point, all we could think of was getting to the next campsite and buying lots and lots of food to eat. The next section began with 100 kilometers of uninterrupted paddling across lakes and rivers through the beautiful national park of Los Alerces. We'd set off early, rising long before sunrise to get ahead of the winds. But the wind never came, and we paddled all day on calm waters with a clear blue sky. The scenery around us was truly stunning, and the water so clear and inviting, perfect for a swim. The river that came next was just something else though. So I'll be quiet for a while and let you enjoy the pictures without interruption. Still, the weather favored us, and after a colorful sunset, we slept out under the open, starry sky on the beach. The morning atmosphere is my favorite, especially on the water. You get the feeling that the whole world is still sleeping, but in nature, the animals are going about their own business. And if you're quiet enough, you'll be able to see what they get up to. Now on that morning's small river section, we saw a nutria and witnessed all manner of birds going about their business. Some of these birds in armies of great numbers. We were expecting the wind to pick up when we reached the monstrously large Lago Futalaufquén. But when we arrived, the waters were dead. The surface was a perfect mirror. It was quite incredible. The only disruption was from us paddling. Then came the Rio Frey, an isolated section of fast-flowing river with multiple rapids, spanning the gap between the two huge lakes. After paddling the first few rapids, we soon reached a point where we could no longer see what lay ahead further downstream. So, in the name of safety, we decided to portage. This may have been the worst decision we made. The forest was thick, visibility was zero, and the going was slow. We suffered bushwhacking and emerged hours later, nearly broken, exhausted and covered in seeds by the river, just in time to fall asleep. The river continued, and after a few more rapids, it began to mellow. By this point, we were as far from any road or other sign of civilization as possible, the river being the only feasible way to pass through this untamed landscape. We explored some small gorges along the river and enjoyed drinking water straight from the small streams. Life can be so simple at times, out in the wilderness. Back out on the open waters of Lago Situación, we stopped to gauge the wind, not wanting to be caught out in the middle of this huge lake, especially after our recent experience with the waves. There were some super interesting rock formations and colors along the shores, to distract us from the long open crossing. We found a beautiful camp spot and cooked up another meager portion of pasta for dinner. By now, more than familiar with this routine. The morning was fresh and clear, and an encouraging tailwind had us flying along towards the end of the lake and the start of Rio Futaleufú. After a short portage, we were on the river, caught in a battle between the wind and the current, as they each struggled to push our little rafts in opposing directions, respectively up and downstream. Luckily for us, the current was the winner, most of the time. We arrived in town to discover that it was the local Chilean rodeo festival, with a competition running all weekend. The rodeo is extremely popular in Chile, and it was amazing to finally see the local horses and their riders in action. The event's copious food was also very exciting. We arrived in the town of Palena by bus, stocked up on food, and made the short walk down to the river fully loaded. The week ahead of us looked very good. We were going to paddle down Rio Palena all the way to the sea. 180 kilometers of uninterrupted, fast-flowing river. What a treat! The river started out quite shallow, and there were a few times we had to hop out the boats to avoid scraping the bottoms. It was a moody, grey day, but the many rapids helped keep us on our toes and distracted. The valley we were in felt dramatic in the rain, with clouds lingered around the forested hills, and waterfalls splashed down from small cliffs. It was a definite change from the landscapes of the last few weeks. One could almost feel that the fjords were approaching. For the first few days, it rained perpetually, without letting up. Luckily, the dry suits kept us pretty much dry, and we even managed to light fires in the evening so that we could dry a few things and boil unlimited cups of tea. You soon learn, though, that in Patagonia, nothing really stays dry. It's just a constant cycle of getting wet and then drying out again, either by the sun or from the wind. And this all happens very quickly and very frequently, just as the weather in Patagonia changes quickly and frequently. Once you accept that, you'll be fine. On the fourth day, things changed. The sun came out, transforming the sky from grey to blue. But with the sun came the wind, a painful headwind that made us work hard to keep floating on downstream. Then, the magic happened. We found a hot spring hidden in the Valdivian rainforest on the banks of Rio Palena. It was the greatest luxury we could imagine, and exactly what we needed. Pure bliss. We continued paddling as though newly born. Our bodies felt fresh and our skin was tingling, the cold and the tiredness of the last days having been washed away. The river widened, and we could tell that we were close to the sea now. We spent one last night by the river, although unusually the mosquitoes were so bad that I simply had to hide in my tent. And then, just like that, we were on tidal waters. Our timing was good, allowing us to float through a small canal straight into the estuary of Raul Marin Balmaceda. Here we met our first dolphins, swimming along with us, heading out to sea. The port was a characteristic little town, but we didn't stay long, hopping on the ferry the next morning. The boat would take us all the way south to Puerto Chacabuco, giving us a scenic tour of the fjords and volcanoes along the way. We decided to paddle Rio Ibañez, a short but powerful river feeding into Lago General Carrera, otherwise known as Lake Buenos Aires, the largest lake in Chile. We found ourselves constantly looking up at this beautiful skyline of mountains, topped with incredible towers of rocks, known as the Cordillera Castillo. Now this river had pace to it, and we clocked up the kilometers quickly, moving on through the landscape. That evening, we were treated to a natural light show as the sun lit up the peaks a warm red. Then, in the morning, it happened all over again. Lucky us. We cruised on downriver, barely paddling at all. We had noticed how, visually at least, dirty the river was. So we made a point of stopping by a clear mountain stream to fill up our water supply. Getting your drinking water from the streams you pass just feels so natural. It's something I really enjoy doing. We continued until we reached the get-out point. A large open green area, often flooded by river water, but today the grazing grounds for cows and horses alike. We had to get out to portage around the huge waterfall section, somewhere no kayaker would like to be paddling. But you can't let all that power go to waste, so I just had to paddle the last little section of flow for a bit of bumpy fun. We took the ferry over Lago Buenos Aires, as it was just too large and exposed to paddle safely. From the farther shore, we began our longest hiking section yet. A 60-kilometer crossing of the deserted plateau of Patagonia National Park. That evening, we enjoyed our last views looking back at the mountains we'd come from, before setting off the next morning into the wilderness. As we climbed higher, we began meeting the true inhabitants of this wild landscape, the guanacos. There is no doubt that this is their true home. They just seem to fit in perfectly. Unlike us, to whom this barren scenery seemed rather challenging and hostile. The plateau stretched on endlessly, a wasteland to our eyes. There were no human footprints for 3 full days, only those of the guanaco. Carcasses littered the ground, and vultures circled the skies above, a reminder of the natural cycles of any true wilderness. There was one last brutal section of road to hike before we arrived at the lakes. 2 vibrantly blue mountain lakes, totally contrasting the monotonous grayscale of the plateau we just crossed. Patagonia National Park is stunning. We truly felt immersed in nature. Lago Verde was a turquoise treasure. I couldn't believe I was living this moment. It all felt so surreal. After the magical lakes, we continued on foot again, following the valley, hiking in the riverbed, often forced to ford the freezing waters. We soon left that valley for another, crossing over via an easy pass, but on weary legs. We were headed for the waters of Rio Chacabuco, which would take us all the way to the fjords again. We had camped right by the river, so that in the morning we would be ready to simply get in the rafts and go. Now, while I was happily eating my breakfast in my tent that morning, we had some surprise visitors. A herd of guanacos were crossing the river, heading for the mountain pastures. Rio Chacabuco started small and fast, with lots of interlacing different streams to paddle, but little time to decide which was the best route. I was finding that it was always the small rivers and streams that were the more interesting ones to paddle. The wider they got, well, the more dull they became, even boring at times. But this river was just perfect for the rafts. Bubbly and quick-paced, it carried us on into our new adventure. We ended the day with a final portage, hiking around the pretty but treacherous gorge section of the river. Of course there were no footpaths where we were heading, so we followed the guanaco trails instead, admiring their ability to effortlessly run up the steep loose slopes. Again, we camped by the river, ready for another day of paddling. A day beginning with a rapid and a surf has got to be a good one. With all the short portaging we were doing, we had become highly proficient at packing up all of our gear, and setting it up as well, of course. We had it down to a casual 10-15 minutes each time. Take off backpack, set up paddle, unroll raft, inflate, top up with a pump, get changed into dry suit, change shoes, put on the safety equipment, repack the bag, carry boat to the water, attach the bag, and go. You see? Very quick. Go, 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 go. After sending the last rapid and eating our last ration of food, Rio Chacabuco flowed into Rio Baker, which we soon left behind in order to restock on food in the nearby town of Cochrane. Luckily, we were saved from another sweaty walk by a local guy with a pickup truck. Way! We were back on the Rio Baker, having stocked up on food and supplies after the last wilderness section. The river is Chile's largest in terms of volume, draining water directly from Lago General Carrera out into the sea at Tortel. Upstream are some of the gnarliest sections of Class 5 whitewater that you could find anywhere on the planet. And even where we were, further downstream, the current was more than strong enough to carry us on through the blustery headwind that picked up later that afternoon. Our first portage was to avoid a rather large and bumpy wave train that would definitely have flipped our top-heavy rafts at the first wave. By this point, it had begun raining, but when you're on the water in a dry suit anyway, it's actually quite refreshing, even enjoyable. And I'd say it brings out a different perspective in the landscape as you pass through. Soon, we arrived at the only major rapid on this section of river. You can't help but feel a certain sense of awe and wonder, mixed with a nervous tingling as you stand by such a mass of rushing water. The ground itself seemed to reverberate with its power. We launched again below the falls, our boats being spun around and pushed about in the mass of boils and whirlpools. Now, I know I mentioned that the rain can be pleasant while paddling, but this ceases to be the case after about 8 hours. This is the point where you'd want to get dry, get warm, eat some good food, and sleep in a cozy bed. Well, we had none of these options, so we stayed in our dry suits until the very last moment, finally hopping into our tents and zipping ourselves into our warm sleeping bags. After yet another rainy day, we were desperate to find shelter for the night, getting lucky with an abandoned little structure. Home sweet home. To our surprise, there was a short dry spell the following morning, which saw us setting off down the river in much better spirits. We had observed overnight how the river level had risen by a significant amount, and now that the clouds began to lift, we could see hundreds of new waterfalls on the mountains all around. It was beautiful, and a few times the sunlight even made it through to our faces. It felt so good. After 4 days on the river, we were finally reaching Tortel, a small village situated right where the river meets the sea. But we weren't stopping. Our route continued to the south, to the land of wind and ice. But first, we had to paddle the fjords. When paddling in the fjords, it can be tricky to find a good camp spot, as the nature of the landscape means that the mountains come straight down to meet the sea, leaving very few places where it's possible to get out the boats, let alone to put up a tent. We were lucky enough to find a beach for the night, with enough space above the high tide mark to fit our tents. As it was raining, we made a makeshift shelter from trash we found lying on the beach to cook under. The next morning, we discovered that the overnight rain had in fact been snow on the hilltops. This explained the cold night, but also added to the character of the scenery. We set off late, having waited for the rain to ease and the temperatures to warm up a little. It was windy on the water, really windy. But as it was a tailwind, this was okay, even if some of the strong gusts threatened to snatch the paddle from our hands. The fjords are a dramatic landscape, where the weather is king, dictating what is possible and when. We truly felt tiny and insignificant on the water, totally at the mercy of the elements. It's thrilling to feel such raw power all around you. We paddled 26 kilometers that day, not even stopping for lunch. Next, though, came 90 kilometers of hiking on a dirt road, beautiful but dull. So after walking the first 20, we managed to hitch a ride with a lovely family, who drove us the rest of the way. Now it was freezing in the back of that pickup truck, but we didn't complain, because finally we were moving fast. Having spent a dry night in a roadside shelter we'd found, we were still 30 kilometers from the town of O'Higgins. Our route was made up of a mix of rivers and lakes, winding its way down the valley. We were surrounded by panoramic views of the mountain peaks, all topped with fresh snow from the last week's cold and rainy weather. But for the next days at least, the sun was back, even if not the warmth. We crossed a lake that day that from a distance looked more like a grassland than a lake. It turned out to be full of reeds, but still paddleable. As we got closer to Villa O'Higgins, the more snow we started seeing on the mountains, and the windier it became. Our neoprene gloves had become a standard part of our paddling kit now, no longer buried deep at the bottom of our packs. It's a remote town, O'Higgins, more of a small village really, that has a distinct end-of-the-world feel to it. Few people make it here, as access is not easy, requiring both effort and time. We took a few rest days here, as my friend had injured his ankle from hiking, and while he rested, I explored the surroundings. All sense of time seemed to disappear in this place, but we had to keep moving. We found a boat that could take us over Lago O'Higgins the next morning, if the weather allowed. They would tell us sometime in the evening. To our luck, the winds were calm, and we got the go-ahead. We heard tales from other travellers of people trapped for weeks because the weather was too bad for any boat to cross. After getting your passport stamped on the Chilean side, you had to then hike 10 kilometers to the border, and then another 10 to the Argentinian border post, where you get your next stamp. And this is considered a major route. I love it. There came the point as we were hiking when we set eyes on Mount Fitzroy for the first time. I was spellbound. It was love at first sight. The mountain exuberates such dominance on the landscape, yet in such an elegant way. And it's right there in the center of the valley. Every line in the landscape leads your eyes to Fitzroy. You just can't help but be drawn to it. The mountain would remain the center of our universe for the next few weeks. We started early the next morning to avoid strong winds as we crossed Lago Desierto. And while it started calm and beautiful, the wind slowly crept up on us from behind. The lake drained into a small river that we paddled as far as we could before having to portage. After a few kilometers on the road, however, we were able to get back onto the river, and we happily floated down almost the entire way to El Chalten. The views were incredible. And just like that, we reached El Chalten in Argentina, the most southern point of our journey and our end goal. But this was not the end. We would still spend a few weeks here in the heart of classic Patagonia, hiking in the mountains. We were in El Chalten, the windiest place on earth, but also the land of rainbows. I guess there were so many because of the crazy weather. It was always trying to give us everything at once: wind, rain, sun, snow, ice. Things moved between hot and cold very quickly here. I had decided to go hiking on my own for a few days to see the famous sights of the area, namely Laguna Torre and its iceberg beach, and of course to get a closer look at Fitzroy and its surrounding glaciers. At Laguna Torre, I spotted a condor soaring overhead, effortlessly managing the high winds. As I made my way down from the ridge, the wind increased to such a level that I could no longer walk, forcing me to desperately crawl my way back down. I can't say I wasn't scared, but the wind truly earned my respect that day. The iceberg beach is quite the sight, littered with pieces of ice of the most amazing shapes. I went back at sunrise to see if the weather would clear, but there were no summits visible yet. The lighting was beautiful though. I made my way over to the camp at the base of Fitzroy, taking the long way around to see the glacier of Piedras Blancas. Again, that evening, I witnessed winds like never before, seeing a huge branch fall directly on another tent. However, it was a mountain start the next day, as I set off in the dark for a view of the sunrise. Little did I know the spectacle I was in for. As the final section of our trip, we decided to hike the Hummel Circuit, a 4-day route that gets you as close as possible to the southern Patagonian ice field. It snowed on the first day, but at least we found a sheltered camp spot, out of the freezing wind, to spend the night. The route had us crossing rivers and scrambling up loose mountainside, finally even forcing us to walk on the glacier itself. From Passo del Vento, or the Windy Pass, the view of the ice field begins. It's impossible, even in person, to comprehend its size. It stretches as far as the eye can see, a vast mass of ice, eventually fading into the clouds. The Viedma Glacier eventually feeds into Lago Viedma, another of the huge southern lakes. Again, there are icebergs floating in the freezing water, fallen from the Great Wall, where ice and water meet. An impressive sight. From our campsite, we could watch as the wind whipped up spray from the lake, and we were grateful to have left the packraft behind on this occasion. First light was magical, and only fitting for our last day on the trail. It was a long day, but a good one. The views finally perfect. We left the next evening, heading back north and home. Patagonia had lived up to all the expectations. We had both seen and learned so much. At every turn, Patagonia had offered us its best. I was most grateful.